In the diamond industry, around 1 million precious stones are being digitised to prevent fraud. Each diamond will have a unique fingerprint identifying its origin and tracing its history, from the mine it came from to the jeweller's shop window, all made possible by blockchain technology.
Blockchain is a new way to store and record transactions. It's very much like a traditional database, but the blocks are linked together cryptographically in order to make sure that they're tamper-proof.
Blockchain technology was invented in 2008 to create a digital currency.
The primary example that people are familiar with is probably Bitcoin. People are using it as digital cash. But actually people have started to use it more and more for things like their last will and testament, or to declare that a diamond isn't a blood diamond, or even for sharing data.
Each block in a blockchain is computer code containing some form of information, such as a contract, certificate of ownership, a statement of authenticity, or proof of a bank's financial transaction. But each block of information in this computer database is securely connected or chained to the other through a digital signature.
If you're trying to send money to relatives, it can take 3, 5, sometimes more days to move the money. And that's because we have to be very certain about where's the money gone to. Before, technology didn't allow us to do that quickly and cheaply. With this technology, it would be faster and cheaper, and it would be more secure because the bank has to digitally sign it and would have an audit trail of every transaction that's ever happened.
As new information is added, the length and complexity of the blockchain increases, and the computer database gets bigger, with more and more people a part of it. But if someone makes an unauthorised change, everyone else in the chain can see where it happened and agree whether the change is valid or not.
For example, you and I could decide that I was going to buy your house for £1,000, and instead of hiring a lawyer, we could actually decide together that we would register that onto a blockchain. So we would record a contract onto the blockchain that would indicate I have agreed at £1,000 on today that I would buy your house. It would give you a public ledger that would be transparent, and anyone could see that I had agreed to pay this. I couldn't go back at a later date and change it to be £500. And we could also do things like transfer the ownership through the title deeds and those kind of things, and that would all be publicly registered in the blockchain. A distributed ledger is something that allows us to produce a tamper-proof record of transactions onto a public ledger. It's very, very similar to how an accounting ledger works, but actually the idea behind a distributed ledger is we get rid of the middleman. We can use distributed ledger technology to help fishermen, for example, in Scotland, to prove the provenance of a piece of salmon. We could say that it was definitely farmed on this time from this lake and in this particular fashion. And that could all be recorded transparently onto a distributed ledger, which anyone would be able to track.
Everyone can have an identical copy of a distributed ledger, and this database of assets is shared across multiple sites. While nothing is invulnerable to cyber attack, hacking it is extremely difficult.
If you had a distributed ledger with 1,000 computers on it, and you had stored a contract into that ledger, someone wanted to come in and hack and change some of the information on that. In order to do that, they couldn't just hack your computer. They would have to hack every single other person's computer at the same time and change exactly the same piece of information.
The technology could also help small-scale farmers, for example by registering the availability of their produce on a blockchain. It could allow them to create economies of scale and guarantee a supply chain to large-scale customers. Within government, there are a number of potential applications for distributed ledgers that could revolutionise the way it works and the delivery of public services.
I believe this technology will have a foundational impact on the way our society runs, the way our government runs, the way that we interact with one another in not just economic transactions, but on a day-to-day basis.
I think blockchain technology is at least as significant as the development of the internet. If the internet brought us near-instant digital communications, then the blockchain brings us near-instant digital asset transfer, asset movement, and security of data movement. That's really, really important to everything in financial services, anything with property or anything with ownership, which is massive for the economy.
G'day, Andreas. I'm Louise. I'm from Suncorp, which is a banking and insurance company here in Australia. Look, my question is actually about the future of Bitcoin into contractual spaces. So what do you see as kind of, how do you see the future playing out with conditions and contractual terms being attached?
Oh, that's a great question. There's a broader space that people are calling Bitcoin 2.0, but in fact, I think is very much part of Bitcoin itself. And the birth of Bitcoin didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened among a community that was very active in talking not just about currency, but about smart contracts and smart property. Bitcoin and transactions within them have a scripting language, and that scripting language can define the conditions you need to redeem an amount of Bitcoin. Now, almost all of the transactions you see on the Bitcoin network today, the condition they have on them is whoever can show the keys for this ownership can redeem the Bitcoin. But it doesn't have to be that way. You can put much more complicated scripts. So you can say, for example, only after a certain date or a certain block number, you can require multiple signatures in a multi-sig as it's known. You can do tiers of multi-sig. You can say one of these 3 or 2 of these 5 and after this date, and make very complex programming contracts. And even beyond Bitcoin, there are other protocols that are exploring that in more detail. I think the space of smart contracts is really exciting because it also ties in very well with what people are calling the Internet of Things and smart property. So let me give you an example of a smart contract that you can execute today. Most cars today have electronic ignition and engine management systems that are keyed off your key. And your key isn't just a metal key that opens the lock on the ignition. It also has, most of them have a chip inside that does a full encrypted challenge response protocol. So the key identifies itself to the car identifies the key, and that unlocks the electronic ignition system. You will find papers online specifically on the idea of smart property where, for example, a car can use the blockchain to identify its owner. So instead of being presented with a physical key, you can present it with a key that's off your mobile wallet, for example, which proves ownership to your car every time you step inside just over Bluetooth with your mobile wallet. But the interesting thing here is that you could sell your car to someone and transfer that token with a Bitcoin transaction. So Sam's here. We create a transaction which has 2 parts. One part gives me $10,000, and the other part of the transaction transfers the key token from my car to Sam. Once that transaction is signed, both parts go into effect. As soon as that transaction is recognized on the blockchain, the car can validate that transaction itself without any external reference. It can validate from the blockchain either by keeping a full copy of the blockchain or by being presented with a part of the blockchain called a Merkle path. It can validate ownership. So the car says, here's a transaction. This transaction says I have a new owner. This transaction has proof of work behind it. It's been included in a block. Therefore, I believe it because it's on the blockchain. And 10 minutes later, once that's part of a block, now the car will start on his key, not mine. I basically not just sold the title and transferred it, but I've also transferred electronic control of the car. And the interesting thing is, this is not in a central registry. This is not the car calling Toyota to find out. It's looking at the proof in the blockchain to discover its own owner and verifying that completely within itself. Those are the kinds of things you can do. You can do that with a car. You could do that with a title for land. You could do that with a registry. In a conference I was at recently, a couple of people put their wedding vows on the blockchain so they could essentially have their marriage registered on the blockchain. The blockchain technology itself is a synchronized, securely timestamped database that can store information about ownership. And that means ownership of anything. So in the Internet of Things, combined with the Internet of Money, you have this incredible potential for creating tokens that transfer ownership for anything you can imagine. And that's a really exciting thing because it's also a much more secure transaction. I don't know if any of you have tried to sell a car. But when you do try to sell a car, what you'll notice is that that kind of transaction attracts a lot of bad actors. So you have to be careful that you don't get robbed at gunpoint. You have to be careful when you're buying a car yourself and showing up somewhere with a lot of cash, that they don't run away with the cash and not give you the car. And when I receive cash for my car, I have to make sure that cash is real, right? It's not easy to tell counterfeits. So if I'm given counterfeit money, then I'm stuck because I've given the car to someone else. But if I'm given a check, then I don't know if it will bounce. I have to go to a bank and do all of this complicated dance inside a bank in order to sell a car. Well, I sold my car in July for Bitcoin. And here's the interesting thing. The person who bought the car wasn't there. They bought it on behalf of their brother. They were in another state in the US. The brother came over, test drove the car. He said, yeah, it looks good. Can you buy it? I gave them my Bitcoin address. They transmitted the money from another state. It was 11 p.m. on a Wednesday. Banking hours were well past, right? What a unique, arcane concept, banking hours. The hell is that? Anyway, so 3 to 5 business days later, no, I'm just kidding. 30 minutes later, I had 3 confirmations. So I sat down and had a late snack at a local eatery. And after 6 confirmations, I signed over the title to the car, and it was done. 6 confirmations was not only enough to secure a 10,000 transaction. I could have sold a Ferrari with 6 confirmations quite comfortably about receiving that kind of money. Now that was a seamless, easy, straightforward transaction. You can't do that with cash. You can't do that with a check. So, and that wasn't even using smart property. It was just the basic Bitcoin. Yes.
Thank you, Andreas, for coming over. And I really like your speech and all your conference that you do. I really would like to ask about the power of mining centralization in, let's say, a couple of countries. What do you think? And although Bitcoin looks like anti-fragile, how do you foresee that we are going to pass or go through that mining centralization power?
That's a very, very good question. So for those of you who are technically minded or have been following the Bitcoin space, one of the characteristics of Bitcoin from the first white paper by Satoshi Nakamoto was the idea that Bitcoin decentralizes power by giving one CPU, one vote. The idea being that by contributing processing power to the network, you become part of the decision-making process. Something interesting happened, though, because the incentives, once it started taking off, were so powerful that people started investing in more complicated computing. And soon, it wasn't CPUs, but GPUs, graphical processing units, that were used to mine Bitcoin. And that represented a 100 times improvement in the ability to mine. Think of it as 1 GPU, 100 votes. And very soon, from GPUs, we went to FPGAs, field programmable gate arrays, which are systems of silicon where you can encode an algorithm and run it really fast. And then we went to ASICs, application-specific integrated circuits, which are basically mining chips designed to do nothing but mining. In each one of these steps, we saw somewhere between 100 and 10,000-fold increase in performance over the previous generation. And that is the primary reason why it caused enormous centralization in mining. However, that game is now over. If you were a miner who migrated to ASICs, then migrating to a system that was printed with a silicon fabrication system at 24 nanometers gave you an advantage of 10,000 times over the previous generation. And you could buy those chips by making a very big order with a semiconductor factory, which means that only very few could put up the necessary capital. And if you could then take that down to 22 nanometers using a more specialized silicon fabrication system, you could get another massive improvement. So we saw mining hardware evolving every 3 to 6 months. Literally, if you set up a warehouse full of mining equipment, it had a shelf life of less than 6 months. In 6 months, it went from the most powerful, most profitable system of mining to being unprofitable for the level of electricity it consumed. And so that created even more centralization, because now the ability to put down more capital every 3 to 6 months to get rapid delivery, to be closely connected to silicon fabrication, centralized mining. And it centralized mining a lot in China, primarily because that's where the silicon fabrication is, and there's also some great opportunities for cheap energy. I don't think that was the vision of Satoshi. Now, I will caution you one thing. A lot of the concern about Chinese mining, in my opinion, is blatantly racist. If mining had centralized in Sweden, we wouldn't be getting so upset, right? So just keep that in mind, because Chinese mining represents excellence in engineering, concentration of resources in engineering, and so far the ability to deliver massive amounts of security and trust for the Bitcoin network at very low cost because of the cost of electricity. That is something we all benefit from. But here's where it gets interesting. As of 6 months ago, we started seeing the fabrication of ASICs at 16 nanometers. 16 nanometer technology is the cutting edge of computer processing. It's what you see in your latest Apple hardware device. And the exponential growth of performance now hits a wall, because there is nothing better than 16 nanometer technology. In computer terms, we have this law called Moore's Law. And Moore's Law, posited by Gordon Moore, the founder of Intel in the 70s, is the idea that every 2 years, approximately, computer capacity doubles. And we've been running ahead of Moore's Law, and in fact, it's been doubling in less than 18 months. That sounds really fast, doesn't it? Unless, of course, you've spent the last 5 years doing 1,000 times faster every 6 months, and suddenly you're down to twice as fast in 2 years. That's a wall of performance. That means that once you put those 16 nanometer things on the shelf, they're going to sit there for 2 years, and you don't have the ability to upgrade them. And that now means that the advantage shifts from the economic power of those connected to silicon fabrication to the ability to deliver these devices as consumer devices. Because with the centralization of mining comes one big disadvantage. If you have 1,000 terahashes in a warehouse, what happens when the warehouse burns down? What happens when you lose electricity to the warehouse? What happens when you lose cooling to the warehouse? What happens when you have a problem with your investors? The centralization now makes you vulnerable to losing everything. Compare that to the possibility of having a mining chip that's part of a toaster or a water heater that's plugged into your kitchen wall. Well, if you have, instead of one system that produces 1,000 terahashes, you have 1,000,000 systems producing 1/1,000,000th of that, they're less vulnerable to disruption. Because if the power goes out in a whole city, it only affects a small percentage of the devices out there. And it may be unprofitable for now for us in the developing world, but in some places in the world, it's going to become profitable to mine on the latest chips using solar energy and hydroelectric power and renewable sources that are less expensive. Which means that, in my opinion, mining centralization reached its peak in 2015. We're going to see now, it's probably going to continue the wave for another year or so. And in July 22nd, 2016, we have an important event. The reward for Bitcoin blocks is divided by 2, half the amount of reward. I think what that will do is it will ensure that anyone who is not mining on the very latest 16 nanometer chips becomes unprofitable, and then we have a level playing field. So I'm not really worried about that. First of all, because we still have great security, and mining centralization hasn't led to any of the nightmare scenarios that we have imagined in Bitcoin. And secondly, because I think it was an artifact of the race of technology to Moore's Law, and now we're done. So again, that was a long explanation. I apologize because it's a very technical topic. Thank you for the question.